name is Noel Sauer, and I'm our county's chair for Ron Paul's 2012 presidential campaign. A lot of you perhaps have heard from me. Is that the coffee? Yeah. No, that's not. I thought people were making noises already.
Want to get in the big crowd.
Anyway, we're here tonight to answer one question, I think. Why should Dr. Ron Paul be our next president? Of course, one obvious answer is this: Dr. Ron Paul should be our next president because our current president has violated our Constitution, perhaps to the point of impeachment. He alone has signed economic treaties with G20 countries and international organizations like the IMF. He's waged war without congressional authorization, even ordered the assassination of American citizens. In short, he has misused and abused our military and our veterans especially. But none of this points to why, of all the candidates running for the Republican ticket, Dr. Ron Paul should be the only one to replace our current president. But he, of all the other candidates, polls best in national polls against our president. He's received the highest number and the highest amount of military contributions nationwide. And he was the first and is the only consistent voice to defend our Constitution and call out our current president. He released a letter addressed to our president just on Monday concerning our military and concerning veterans. I quote, "As a doctor, an Air Force veteran, and a congressman who serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee and has always fought for the best interest of our troops, I was deeply concerned to learn that our military retirees are now facing benefit cuts under our president's proposed $1.5 trillion tax hike. Our military men and women have fought bravely. In exchange, our country made a promise to them, and we must honor it. There are trillions of dollars in unwise, unconstitutional spending we must cut." I'm still reading Paul here. "There are few other leaders in Washington willing to cut spending as deeply as I am and truly balance our budget. But we must make sure that we take care of our veterans who fought to take care of us. We have put our troops in harm's way, and we must honor our promises. And our troops have paid a heavy price these past 10 years. Over 5,000 have lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. 40,000 have seen crushing injuries. And hundreds of thousands more suffer from brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Failing to meet the promises we have made to our troops would be unjust and immoral. The cuts, our president, that you announced on Monday, combined with the rumored cuts and benefits reported in publications like Army Times, have our soldiers and veterans deeply concerned. Mr. President, instead of cutting our veterans' benefits, I call on you to support our troops. Support them by bringing them home to our shores to protect our borders and defend our country. Ensure that they are rested and equipped to repel any real credible attack. Reunite them with their families. And make sure they no longer play policemen in dangerous foreign civil wars. Cutting the benefits of our veterans benefits while we subsidize the security of other wealthy nations like Germany and Japan makes no sense. The money we would save extracting our fighting men and women and our equipment from overseas conflicts and regions will more than offset the savings you seek by upending the manner in which veterans receive care. Do not mistake me for a pacifist or a person solely focused on the economics of the unsustainable global security and state building that's taken our country to the shores of financial ruin. On the contrary, I consider my military service as an Air Force flight surgeon during the Cold War to be among my highest personal and professional achievements. Authentic, constitutionally sound national security, a strong national defense, begins with guarding our borders. Mr. President, I call upon you to support our troops, honor our veterans, and ensure our wounded get the care that they deserve." End quote. And with that, I thank you for coming tonight and turn this over to our next speaker, Jim Litchin of Jackson County, Bellevue Township, who will be talking about agriculture and the economy. After him, Roger finally, John Furland, who is our district coordinator for the campaign, will close with some remarks. I look forward to questions and discussions after they speak. Thanks for being here. I look forward to meeting some of you.
Hello, my name is Jim Blitzen from Bellevue, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our economy, a bit about the history of how this economic mess we are in came to be, and the important role agriculture plays in our national economy. Watching the president's debates, Congressman Ron Paul does not get many questions on economic matters, but Dr. Paul is very knowledgeable on economic issues. Dr. Paul serves on the House Financial Services Committee and the Foreign Services Committee. On the House Financial Services Committee, Dr. Paul serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Domestic Policy. It is Congressman Ron Paul we can thank for his efforts in getting a partial audit of the Federal Reserve, thus finding out, for example, that $5 trillion of bailout money went to foreign banks. We are constantly being told by the media and mainstream politicians that we need to throw money to corporations and manufacturing to create jobs to help our economy. So it may seem contradictory when Dr. Paul says that it's not about the jobs, but rather about getting back to the principles of sound money, then the jobs will come. That subsidizing manufacturing and corporations to create jobs is putting the cart before the horse. So where does this sound money come from that feeds the rest of the economic system that created the jobs and brings real wealth for the people of this nation? Our history can tell us. Our founding fathers understood where this real wealth comes from. Writing in the positions to be examined concerning national wealth on April 4th, 1769, Benjamin Franklin pointed out that there are three ways for which a nation might become wealthy. Number one is by war, which permits taking by force the wealth of other nations. Number two is by trade, for which to be profitable requires cheating. For example, if we give and receive equal trade, there is no profit other than what is obtained from our own production cycle. And number three is by agriculture, through which we plant the seeds that creates new wealth as if by miracle. It was known by this country's founders that real wealth comes from the earth, our raw materials. In the United States, 70% of the source of these raw materials comes from our farmers and ranchers, from agriculture, followed by mining, forestry, etc. It is the supply of raw materials that determines the number of jobs available. You cannot even make a pencil if you don't have the wood, the lead, or the rubber. It is the dollar value put on these raw materials that determines the amount of money which can and must be used to produce, buy, and move all raw materials through the economy. As various costs are added, such as labor and capital costs, these factors pyramid themselves into national income. And it is the price paid for raw materials that automatically becomes the total number of earned dollars available for the purchasing of manufactured goods. It determines the level of profits and savings for the economy. This is where that first dollar enters the economy. It does not start with jobs. It does not start with manufacturing. Let us not forget that 70% of the source of this first sum of money comes from agriculture. Starting in the 1920s, going through the 60s, several gentlemen of profound knowledge about macroeconomics re-examined Benjamin Franklin's principles of economics by researching and analyzing our nation's economic records. In the 1930s, Carl Wilkin, an economist from Webster City, Iowa, who founded the Raw Materials Council, later renamed the National Organization of Raw Materials, along with John Lee Coulter, Dean of North Dakota's Agriculture Programs, and Charles These guys set out to find out what really caused the Depression in 1929 and to determine if future depressions could be avoided. What they discovered was not considered theory, but rather as a fact, as if a complete audit of a business was taken. Using the economic reports to the president and all other information at their disposal, these men found that every time in our nation's history when there was full employment, no debt expansion, low public and private debt, and no inflation, were times when the price paid for the production of raw materials in agriculture were equal to the price of labor and manufacturing costs. The term used here is parity. Parity meaning equal to something. When the price that was paid to the American farmer was equal to the price of labor and the cost of manufacturing, the economy operated on an earned income basis with no buildup of public or private debt. Every dollar that was earned for the production of raw materials at parity prices ultimately turned into 7 times national income. Whenever raw materials entered trade channels at less than these parity prices with labor and capital costs, the economy lacked enough earned income dollars to operate debt-free. Therefore, we had a rise in public and private debt. Starting in 1925, Carl Wilken found there was a steady decline in the prices of raw materials. U.S. investors that had invested money in foreign sources of raw materials, such as sugar plantation, oil wells, and so on, these investors managed to get these cheap raw materials into the United States, destroying the foundation of our domestic income, that being the price paid for the production of raw materials that feeds the rest of the economic cycle. Our national income was cut in half and no money was being generated for purchasing. It was then that the walls of Wall Street came down. Congressional testimony by Carl Wilken and other members of the Raw Materials Council, along with the state commissioners and secretaries of agriculture, led to the passage of the Stiegel Amendment, setting the parity price for agriculture at 90 to 92.5%. It was this measure that put the horse pulling the wagon. These parity laws were in place from 1942 to 1952. By 1952, America was on its feet and most of the cost of World War II was paid for. Sadly, in 1952, these measures were dropped and history was about to repeat itself. Carl Wilken and his associates had proven that 70% of the source of this nation's first real income came from agriculture. Wealthy world traders knew this also, and even before the provisions of the Stiegel Amendment were dropped, these corporations started to push to gain control of the source of our real money, our farmers. Much of the farm bills and legislation from 1952 to the present has done nothing more than to depopulate rural America. The Farm Bureau, along with its early ties to the Federal Reserve, was the fox sent to guard the hen house. In 1973, the gold standard was dropped and the gold strings that tied our dollar to something of real value were cut. Doing so got rid of the limiting factor of how much debt could be created. In the 1980s, the farmer was told to get big or get out, and a lot of them did. Buying farms with borrowed money on the promise of $4 corn, corn dropped back to $2 when the combines hit the fields and more farms were lost. The recent housing market collapse happened in about the same way. Ron Paul, as early as 2003, saw it coming. He addressed Congress on what was about to happen and gave recommendations on steps to take to prevent the collapse, but his words went on deaf ears and the housing bubble burst. Our present high farmland prices are tempting small farm owners to sell, and our big farmers, wanting to get bigger, are being given the loans to buy them. Farmland that was once owned free and clear now has been mortgaged off to the banks. What will this bubble do? In 1994, with Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole leading the way, the United States became members of the World Trade Organization. Prior to that, our Constitution stated that Congress had the power to regulate foreign trade and set tariffs. By joining the World Trade Organization, that power was given to the foreign bodies of the United Nations and to the World Bank. For the traders to sell foreign commodities on the cheap world market, price supports for agriculture were exchanged for taxpayer subsidies to the farmer. During years of highly subsidized corn, corporations are able to purchase this corn for at or below the cost of production, yet we still have to pay $5 for a box of corn flakes. And even more disturbing than the $5 box of cereal is what effects subsidized corn is doing elsewhere. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, went into effect in a flood of highly subsidized U.S. corn flowed into Mexico. By the year 2000, in just 6 years, Mexico's domestic corn prices dropped 50%, and 1/3 of Mexico's corn farmers were put out of business. This severely hurt that country's agriculture base, which is also a major source of the first sound money in their economy. This practice was done in other countries like Haiti and just all over the place. This has been going on. In this country, efforts by the USDA and the FDA to regulate the small farmer and vegetable producers is getting out of hand. The recently passed Food Modernization and Safety Act came terribly close to regulating all food grown for human consumption. That's our backyard garden and farmers markets. On June 9th of this year, President Obama established the White House Rural Council. By way of an executive order, without congressional approval, a council was created with a mission, and I quote, to increase the effectiveness of federal engagement with rural stakeholders, including agricultural organizations, small businesses, educational and training institutions, healthcare providers, telecommunications providers, research and land grant institutions, law enforcement, state, local, and tribal governments, and non-governmental organizations, unquote. That is a whole lot of government where government is not supposed to be. I am for Ron Paul because he is a strong advocate of states' rights and personal rights and liberties. I am for Dr. Paul because he wants to put a real dollar in my pocket by returning to sound fiscal practices. He wants to stop foreign interventions by our military and unfair trade practices and break our ties with the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Ron Paul is consistent on his stance on issues, telling things like it is, good news or bad. He is always constitutionally correct and has a keen understanding of what works and what doesn't and why. Most importantly for me is that our president, as our president, he just wants to leave me alone and let me think for myself. Ron Paul has stated that he wants to give the government back to the people, but he can't do it without the help of the people, and we are the people. Thank you. He's next.
I'll say it. Who's next? My name's Roger Kistler, and I'm from Jones County. I'm the Jones County Chair for the Ron Paul campaign. And my wife and I own a small production machine shop. I make screws for a living. It always gets a chuckle. I don't know why. Actually, that's what I do. I had to quit a little early tonight, and so I was making screws right before I got here. So, I have interest in small business, obviously, from a personal standpoint, but also with regard to Ron Paul. If you, how many of you have ever heard Ron Paul speak? Show of hands, real quick. Okay. First of all, if you have access to a computer, go to Google and go to YouTube, and then type in Ron Paul, and then just pick little videos and listen to what he has to say. It doesn't make any difference when he said it, whether it was 30 years ago or 10 years ago or last week. It's all the same. He hasn't changed his message at all. I would encourage you, those of you who haven't heard Ron Paul speak, to do that. I think that's just good advice. He's probably best known for two phrases. Number one, audit the Fed, and number two, end the Fed.
Okay, yeah.
And I can maybe give you a little insight on how that position of his is very, very important to understand the topic for tonight. Now, what I've been asked to talk about is why has small business declined in the United States? Or what has happened to small business in the United States? And keep in mind, his position on the Fed is really, really dovetailed closely to that issue. And as we learn about the Federal Reserve, you're going to say, now I understand what Jim is saying about this economy and things like bubbles and that sort of thing. I understand now why there's not too many, screw machine shops around anymore. It gives you a little insight on some foreign policy issues as well. Now, I want you to think just momentarily. At one time, there were people who made a living making 2 pairs of shoes a day. At one time, there were people who made a living just grinding wheat for flour to sell. At one time, there were people who sold screws, for a living. There was people who made screws super a living too. Believe me, there's fewer. A lot of Chinese are making screws now. That's a trade type joke. That's not funny. Those guys are tough competitors. Let me tell you, you can't compete. Anyhow, that's a side issue. At one time, a family could make a living farming 80 acres and milking 10 cows. At one time, you could have 5 families that believed the same thing, who could pool their resources and build a church and hire a minister to attend to their spiritual needs. Now, the reason why I mention that is those were all small type things that just can't happen now. If you tell somebody to go out and buy 80 acres of ground and milk 10 cows and raise a family of 8, you get laughed out of county. At least I would out of Jones County, I don't know. You get my point. Okay, things have changed. Now, I'm going to pass around a lot of things. A lot of them are really, really old, and so the things that are in some kind of a holder, please leave them in there. Don't take them out. The things that aren't, you can pass around. If you get nothing from my presentation tonight, if you get nothing, and you're taking notes, this is what you want to say. This is what you want to take home with you. The currency that we have elected to use has inflated beyond our capacity to produce. Say that you. Okay. The currency that we have elected, we as a country have elected, decided to use, the Federal Reserve note, has inflated beyond our capacity to produce. Okay, now I'm going to explain what that's all about, so don't, I'm not worried that all the eyes are glued. What you have to understand, coming right out of the chute, and this is why I like Ron Paul, because he understands this. And if you go to YouTube and listen to what he has to say, what he's going to say is something like, well, our monetary system has to change. And it runs right past everybody, unless you know a few real fundamental things about how money happened in the United States. Jim is right on. Do you know what the first currency of the United, or it wasn't the United States, of the town of Jamestown was? The first currency that was used in Jamestown? Tobacco. That's exactly correct. That was an agricultural product. It was tobacco. Now what you have to understand is that for over 300 years, our country was built and prospered using multiple currencies. We didn't have one currency. We had multiple currencies. Hundreds of them. You just stop and think about it, there was no U.S. currency during the colonial days. I mean, Jamestown started in 1607 and we didn't even have a constitution until 1787. So we got 185 years there where there was no country. So what are we going to use to carry on trade? Well, things were growing big time during that time, and it was because they were issuing multiple currencies. This oops, is a coin I'm going to pass around. This was known as the VOC, and that's the coin that basically built New York State. It was the Dutch coin. It was the Dutch money. That one's dated 1777. Okay? It stood for the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, and we know it as the East India Company. The East India Company issued their own money. And what did it do? It built the New York State. Here's another one. This one is neat. This is a Spanish coin. This one's dated 1883. And this was the, you know, how we talk about the Federal Reserve note being the world reserve currency. Well, this was the world reserve currency back in those days. Okay. This is the Spanish 8 reales coin. The piece of 8, that's it. And that was used throughout colonial times. This was one of the hundreds of currencies that was in use. That stuff right there was legal tender up through the 1800s. In other words, if you had a tax to pay to the federal government, you could pay it with Spanish money. Okay? Hundreds of currencies. Companies, the East India Company, individuals, religious groups could all issue their own money. This was true up until the Depression, basically. At one time, there were over 12,000 banks here in the United States that issued their own money. Maquoketa had one of them. Maquoketa had a bank. During the national banking era, they issued their own money. This one here, this is 1777. Yeah, 1777 dollar. Well, this is the account over. This is New York currency. You know, 5 shillings is a heck of a lot of weight. So that's New York. What they did is they issued a certificate that you could redeem for an actual coin. Okay. Okay. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that there were hundreds of different currencies in use. Over in Jones County, we had the Wassapinican Land Company issued its own money. Now, what do you suppose it used to back its money? Land across, right next to the Wassapinican River. Yeah. If you wanted to cash in your money, you could get a hunk of land on the Wassapinican. Okay. Hundreds of different kinds of currencies. In fact, later on, thousands of different currencies. What does that do? That creates competition. So if you think that the currency that you're issuing, if I think that that's not good, I'll go over here and I use this currency. Well, then what does that do to this one? Well, that makes them more competitive, you see? This is why you could buy a pair of shoes in the 1600s for $2.50. And you could buy a pair of shoes in the 1700s for $2.50. And you could buy a pair of shoes in the 1800s for $2.50. And at the beginning of the 20th century, you could buy a pair of shoes for, anybody guess? $2.50.
$2.50.
Okay, yeah. $2.50. Yeah. It leads to an economy that is stable. And you can plan on it. And you can prosper as a result of that. Those were all commodity-based currencies, there was something backing them up, even though it was paper. That one that I'm passing around from New York was paper, but it had a commodity. It had gold or silver backing it. Okay?
Something people could believe in.
Something that not only people could believe in, but something that people could use. Now, here's something you got to keep in mind. Let's say, okay, let's take this silver. Let's take this silver coin here. Well, this one here, 1883. You take this silver coin. What value is it? Well, I can make this into, let's say, 3 different rings. And here's the key. That's just as true today as it was 3,000 years ago. This amount of silver can make the same number of rings today that it could 3,000 years. See, the value of it hasn't changed. If you take a bushel of wheat, if your currency is based on a bushel of wheat, a bushel of wheat weighs roughly 60 pounds. You can make 61-pound loaves of wheat, of bread, out of a bushel of wheat. The value of a bushel of wheat for making bread hasn't changed since wheat was invented. You can still get 60 pounds of bread. See how this works? Now, something happened in the colonial days, and the Continental Congress got together and said, hey, it looks like we're going to have a war here going on. We need money. And so Continental Congress said, okay, well, let's issue some money. We'll call it the Continental currency. Here's some Continental currency. This is it. And as far as I know, everything is real, okay? So if it isn't, I really got stung on that. So the first Continental Congress, they didn't own any land. They didn't own any silver mines. They didn't have anything. They just had an idea that they wanted these colonies to be free. So they said, okay, but we'll tell everybody that we're going to back this continental currency up with silver. And so if you read it, it says it's backed by silver. Well, the colonists, goodness heaven's sakes, they've used hundreds of different currencies. Tobacco was the first one. They knew that the Continental Congress didn't have any silver in a warehouse anywhere. They didn't have a warehouse, okay? So what do you suppose the colonists did with that currency, the continental currency?
That I don't give a continental.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they didn't use it. That's right. They didn't use it. And so what do you suppose the Continental Congress did? They said, well, gosh, since nobody's using it, we better print more. And so they did. So what happened to the value of the continental currency? This is the mid-1770s now, okay? The same as some of the dates that I'm passing around. It became worthless. That was a fiat currency. There was nothing backing it. You see? So now we have commodity-based currencies and we have fiat-based currencies. When you hear Dr. Paul talk about a fiat currency, he's talking about a currency that isn't backed with nothing. Well, it's not worth as much as it used to be, that's for sure. Yeah. Actually, our Federal Reserve note has lost about 98% of its value. Since 1913. Okay, so then, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay, so now, I see some of you have your pocket constitutions out, and so if you turn, oh, that's not a pocket constitution. Some of you had turned to Article 1, Section 8, and you'll read in there, Congress has the authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Congress doesn't have the power to print money. It doesn't have the power to print money. Why? Because the first Continental Congress had such a disastrous result on that continental currency I just passed around. Nobody used the darn stuff. How are you going to pay an army with something that nobody wants to? It was a disaster. It was a monetary disaster. So the people who then, after the war, drafted the Constitution said, hey, we got to make sure that the only thing we use is a commodity-based monetary system. Ron Paul, monetary system. Founding fathers, we got to have a proper monetary system. You see how we're going here? And so, in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, down a ways, Congress shall have the authority to coin money Well, in order to coin money, you gotta have things like silver, gold, platinum, things like that. And regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin. If we get a question about China, that'll become important. And regulate the value thereof. Okay? And they say, well, gosh, what about the states? Because all the colonies have their own money. I mean, there's at least 13 currencies there. And one or two different kinds within the so everybody has issue with money. I mean, there's hundreds of colonies. So the founder said, well, we got to make sure that when we have these states, they don't go start printing up money the same way we did. We know this fiat stuff isn't any good. So if you look at Article 1, Section 10, Article 1, Section 10, it says specifically that the states shall only use gold and silver as a tender for payment of debt. Now I'm going to ask for a show of hands. For those of you who have had a tax return in the last 5 years, how many of you got your money back from the state of Iowa in gold and silver? Yeah. Exactly. We're not paying attention to the Constitution, or at least Article 1, Section 8. And you know, for a while, we weren't even paying attention to that first one because, God, the Federal Reserve ran everybody else out of business. Here's what happened. Okay? We had these multiple currencies going through. Went up to the Civil War. At the point of the Civil War, the problem with, what's the problem? I'm really going, I better hurry up. Well, take my time. Okay, but I don't have time. What's that? Keep it going? Okay, got all night? Well, I don't know about that. I can go mix more screws. I'm probably the only guy in Jones County whose wife sends him off and they're happy when he screws around all day. So what happened is we had these multiple currencies. Okay, now do you see a problem with using a Wapsipinicon land company dollar, you know, in what then became the United States? Does anybody see any problem with that?
Yeah, I don't know about the Wapsipinicon.
You don't know about Wapsipinicon. So are you really going to want to trade that dollar in for some land along the Wapsipinicon? No, you're not. You see, that kind of currency was real regional. And it's okay to deal in cotton dollars, you know, if you can redeem it for cotton, but you know, we're not going to redeem very much cotton up here if one of their bills gets up here. So those multiple currencies were very, very regional. Very, very regional depending upon the commodity that backed the currency. Everybody with me here now? Okay. So to get around that, we said, okay, well, let's have a national currency. And the deal was this. If 5 or more investors had $50,000 or more, they could issue their own currency. It was called the national banking system. And it would be good throughout the United States because everybody played by the same rules. So we got 5 people here. Each of them represent their group of investors, and they each have $50,000. Well, they each have $100, okay? Each have $100. And here was the beauty of the system. The beauty of the system was they could only issue 90% of the gold that they had. So if you have $100 in gold, you can only issue $90 and put it out in circulation. Okay? Now, you have $100 in gold, okay? And you issued $90. And these 4 people here have everybody out here has got the $90, but you get panicked. They say, I don't know, he's wearing a hat. I don't like the guy that wears a hat. So, we can't trust his bank. So everybody cashes in their money, okay? What's your status as a bank? If everybody cashed in their money for gold, he's still solvent. See, he had $10 of gold in reserve. The national banking system, which ran from basically the Civil War to 1913, actually a little bit later, was a fail-safe system. It was a commodity-based monetary system, which Dr. Paul will talk about systems, okay? It was a commodity-based monetary system that even if there was a run on the bank, there was still reserve. Now granted, going from $100 of value down to 10, you were hurt. I mean, that's no denying that. But he was still solvent. Okay?
So was everyone else.
still solvent, he was still in business. Something happened in 1913. Something happened in 1913. I forgot something. Okay, so the Constitution says the United States government can only, what money? What kind of money? Only coin money, only coin money. So the official, here's a dollar from the United States government, right here. I'll pass it around. Okay? The official money of the United States government consists of a silver dollar, pass it around, a $5 gold piece, I'll pass one of those around, they're beautiful, beautiful works of art. This is a $5 gold piece, a $10 gold piece, a $25 platinum piece, a $50 gold piece, and a $100 platinum piece. That's the money of the United States. Not many people, number one, realize that, and number two, even fewer people use that stuff in their day-to-day transactions. Now, the cool thing about this is that the United States currency has anywhere from about 30 to 45 times the purchasing power of the green stuff that you got in your pocket. If we were using United States currency, Dr. Paul, our problem is our monetary system. I could go to Von Maur tonight and pay $2.50 and get a very nice pair of shoes. So that's the monetary system of the United States. And of course, then what's this other stuff we use? Well, it's the Federal Reserve. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress, and it just created another bank. That's basically what it is. It's just another bank. Actually, it's 12 banks. But it created a Federal Reserve System. And the charter on it isn't that long. It's not that big of a document. You can read it on the internet. You can read the original document. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. Remember, the national banking system required the banks to have 10% or $10 in reserve, a gold of a commodity in reserve. The Federal Reserve said, or the Federal Reserve Act said, well, yeah, that same thing's going to apply to the Federal Reserve note, or they can have 135% of Federal Reserve notes. Come on. And when you read that, it's by the way, section 16 of the Act. When you read that, you say, wait a minute, what does this mean? It means this. If the Federal Reserve wants to issue $100, all it has to do is print $135, keep 35 of it, and let the other 100 go out. That's the game. You just have to print 135% of what gets issued. So you hear, $1 billion is going out there. Actually, they got $1 billion, 300 million somewhere that they printed up, and that's what the reserve is. More Federal Reserve dollars. Well, yeah, they are. But we're not quite to the worthless stage yet, okay? We're not quite to the worthless stage. But, and this is doggone, it was like Jim said, this is really, really hurt. The Federal Reserve dollars were, at one time, fully redeemable for gold.
Yeah, didn't it used to say that on the currency exchangeable for gold at one time?
The United States currency did. Federal Reserve notes never did.
Oh, they never did.
Federal
Okay.
Reserve never did. So now let's take this situation again. We've got $100 in gold here, okay? We've got $90 worth of his currency from a national bank that's out in circulation. But then you've got $50 in Federal Reserve notes, okay? You've got $50 in Federal Reserve notes. Okay, so you guys get all excited. Oh my heaven's sakes, the stock market is doing real weird things. We better cash in our money for gold. Okay, which, everybody does it. You listen to the radio now. Okay, we're going to cash it in for gold. So they come to the bank. Yeah, here's the $90 in gold, but you still got how much in reserve? You still got the $10 in gold, okay? Just like you did before. Now along come you got $50 in Federal Reserve notes, which are fully redeemable for gold. You come here and say, I need $50 in gold. You say, I don't have it, I only got $10 in gold. And you say, I'll take it. What just happened to his bank? It's now solid. You don't have any reserves. You see? And one by one, ping, 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 the banks went down the drain. Now, doesn't make any difference what currency you use. If you issue more of the currency, that's called inflation. How's my time hold on? Okay. Doesn't make any difference what the currency. If you mine more silver and make more silver coins, inflation has incurred. An increase in the money supply is called inflation. A lot of times, inflation causes prices to rise. In fact, most of the time it does. But sometimes it doesn't. An increase in the money supply is inflation. Okay, yes, question?
But isn't that only if there's not a commensurate increase in the value? If you mined more silver, you created more value. So you therefore, you didn't dilute the currency and cause inflation.
No.
You just added
don't
to
cause
the
inflation.
currency.
Inflation is just simply putting more money into the pot. In fact, that happened at the tail end of the 1800s when we found the Comstock lode out in Nevada. Well, what happened is we discovered a whole bunch of silver, and so this is kind of interesting. For the longest time, the United States government said if we have $100 million of gold in reserve, we can cover everything. Okay, $100 million. This was in 1894. Okay, and so $100 million, that was the rule of thumb. And we found the Comstock lode, and we came up with all this extra silver. Well, this was the world's reserve, well, the one I passed around was the world's reserve currency. That was made out of silver. Okay, so then the Spanish and the people in Europe said, oh, there's too much silver here. It's going to make it, we're inflating the amount of silver that's in circulation, so that therefore means the value is going to go down and whatnot. So they started cashing in their gold. And we got down to $10 million. And Grover Cleveland and J.P. Morgan got together, did a backroom deal. And J.P. Morgan, remember I said that there were a whole bunch of other people had money? Okay, well, J.P. Morgan had as much money as the United States did. And I'm not serious. Because he floated the $90 million it took to run the, he loaned the money to the United States government to keep it afloat.
You have founder of the Fed, right? JP?
No, not really, not quite. He was involved with it deeply. But the point I'm getting at is an increase in the money supply is inflation. Okay, well what happened is this. With the Federal Reserve printing money, okay, it just inflated the money supply. There wasn't enough gold to go around. There wasn't enough commodity, whatever the commodity was, to redeem for the gold. Now see, Dr. Paul understands this history. He understands this. And what's happened is that in order for, if you read the original charter, basically the Federal Reserve has to inflate the money supply by 4% a year. Basically, that's got to happen. In order for it to work, they've got to increase the amount of money by 4% a year. And here's what happened to small businesses. Let's say I'm making screws. Okay? Let's say I can make 100 screws a day. In order to keep up with inflation, in order for my productivity to keep up with inflation, that means that next year I'm going to have to make 104 screws a day. Everybody with me? In order to have the parity, my productivity has to increase the amount that the monetary system that we're using inflates. Okay, so now the first year I have to make 104 parts. Well then, the next year I have to make 4% more. So I have to make, let's say, 106. And then I have to make 110. And then I have to make, see? The illustration I use is a guy by the name of Herb Elliott. In 1958, Herb Elliott ran the mile in 4 minutes. That's running 15 miles an hour. If Herb Elliott had to increase his productivity, in other words, run faster by 4% a year, okay, by 2011 he had to be running 112 miles an hour. That is a physical impossibility. It's physically impossible to increase your productivity by 4% a year continuously. That is what has happened to our small businesses. One by one, they can no longer produce enough to keep up with the inflationary monetary system that we have. What does Dr. Paul suggest? Dr. Paul says, let's get rid of the laws that make other currencies illegal, and let's allow for, once again, competing currencies. My favorite would be a currency based on corn. You know, obviously I have a vested interest in the area. Down south, the currency may be based on cotton. You see how this works?
Mm-hmm.
Some currencies may be based upon gold. Some may be based upon silver. But if we had multiple currencies, once again, we would have competition among the currencies. Things would settle down. A person could plan for their retirement 50 years in advance because now we know how much it takes to live after retirement. We don't have to worry upon the inflation. We wouldn't have things like cost of living increases because things wouldn't increase. Shoes would still be $2.50. So why do I support Dr. Paul? Dr. Paul understands this. Dr. Paul has studied this. Dr. Paul has voted accordingly. The thing of it is, it just hasn't been in vogue. It just really hasn't been. People want to talk about, oh, we're going to raise this tax, lower this tax, and we get all excited about this tax, that tax. It isn't the tax system. Well, that's a problem. It's definitely a problem. It's our deficit as a result of the type of currency we're using, the inflation that has come about as a result of this Federal Reserve note that we're using. So with that, that's a very big reason why I support Dr. Paul, because he seems to be the only guy that seems to get it, really understand. And it's not that tough. I think probably everybody here understood why it's that. It's but you probably got some questions. Yeah, no, yeah.
Would it just take legislation to introduce new currency, competing currency?
It's going to have to take a mindset change.
Yeah.
When I tell people that our country was built and prospered using multiple currencies for 300 years, most people don't believe that because they've got the green dollar and that's American currency. I mean, that's United States. It says United States. Look at the front of it. It says United States current. It says United States of America on the front of it, doesn't it? It says it right there. Maybe I got it down.
Oh, it's Federal Reserve.
Yeah, it's fraudulent.
Look at it. No, it's not fraudulent. I got a T-shirt that says United States of America. But the United States government didn't issue my T-shirt. It's the very same thing. What you got to pay attention to is the fine print up top where it says Federal Reserve Note. Now, have any of you ever gone to the bank and taken out a note? What is a note?
Promise to pay.
It's a note. The Federal Reserve loan is what you've got right in your hand. You've got a Federal Reserve loan. You don't have a certificate redeemable for silver. The Federal Reserve ran the United States out of the silver certificate business in 1963. Actually, here's something that's kind of interesting. It's also a Ron Paul fact. Do you realize that the Federal Reserve ran everybody, all the national banks, everybody out of business, so they no longer issued their money. It ran everybody out. It even ran the United States government out of the money issuing business. And it wasn't until 1985 that a congressman was able to get legislation passed that once again resumed the United States issuing coin as it says in the Constitution. Guess who that congressman was? Ron Paul. Ron Paul. That was 1985. Yeah.
Who owns the Federal Reserve? I mean,
Who owns the Federal Reserve?
Rockefeller, JP Morgan, Warburg.
The Federal Reserve
The other
is
guys in 1913.
the Federal Reserve is set up as being 12 corporations.
Oh,
They're corporations. The Federal Reserve has as much to do with the federal government as Federal Express has to do with the federal government, okay? It has nothing to do with the federal government, other than the fact that the president appoints the chair of the whole thing. These 12 banks, and they're located throughout the United States, are corporations. They have a board of governors that oversees the affairs of those 12 banks, and then there's a chairman of that board of governors, and that happens to be Bernanke right now. So who owns it? Whoever the stockholders are in each of the individual 12 banks. Who are those people? Here's some that's kind of funny about the Federal Reserve.
We don't know.
It's illegal to audit the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, they got so much power, I mean, they're not just gonna give that up either.
No, they're not gonna give it up. Jim mentioned an audit that was released in July of this year. I'm gonna briefly touch on it to give you, I wanna follow up on, you said they have so much power. Okay, now, everybody's heard the news. For the last 40 or 50 years, the United States government has accumulated about $14.3 trillion in debt. Everybody's aware of that. You've heard about the debt crisis and that. Okay, we've accumulated about $14.3 trillion. Dr. Paul was able to get an amendment put onto a bill, an appropriations bill, that allowed just a real small snapshot of the Federal Reserve's activities between December 2008 and June of 2010. In less than 2 years, the Federal Reserve gave 0 interest loans to favored corporations and favored countries to the tune of $16 trillion. Now let's review these numbers, because numbers are sometimes off here. I'm not saying, the brief audit that Dr. Paul was able to get done said that the Federal Reserve gave away more money in less than 2 years than what our entire country accumulated in the 40 or 50 years. Now we're going to go back to your statement. Is it therefore true then that, at least economically, the Federal Reserve has more power than the United States? I would say so. By a long shot.
Yeah.
By a long shot. So then back to Noel's question. Who's running the Federal Reserve? Back to my answer. We don't know. Why? Because since 1954, it's been illegal to audit the Federal Reserve. You see why Dr. Paul wants to have the Federal Reserve audited?
And I was watching something that said that income taxes, goes just to pay the interest to the Fed on the money they loan to the government.
Yeah, it's interesting to note, if you look at your Constitution, the 16th Amendment was passed in February of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in December of 1913. You see, the United States funded everything it did up to 1913 without an income tax. It funded all of its, all the armies and all of the trade stuff and whatever the United States does was funded through taxation other than an income tax. So therefore, if you got to pay interest on money you're borrowing from this corporation called the Federal Reserve, the federal government is going to borrow the money from the Federal Reserve and pay interest on that money. Well, the next question is, well, where are we going to get the money to pay for the interest?
Yeah.
Where are we going to get it? You got to have another revenue stream. That's where the federal income tax comes in.
It's a direct tax, not an apportioned one. And
Right.
That's how I think it states in the 16th Amendment. So it's illegal.
Right.
Actually, according to the Constitution.
Well, according to the original one, but then that whole thing, the 16th Amendment thing, that's a whole funny business. But what are we getting at is that provided the revenue stream to fund the Federal Reserve interest that the federal government had to pay when it borrowed money from the Federal Reserve. See, you got to remember, the Federal Reserve is like my little corporation. It's a corporation. I'm a greedy individual. I own a corporation. My wife and I. So it's half her fault.
You screw people out of their money.
Yeah, I screwed you.
104 next year.
I'll remember that one. But here's something you gotta think about. Okay? If you wanted to buy screws from me, I'd make them, I'd sell them to you. If you wanted to buy screws from me, I'd sell them to you. If you wanted to buy screws from me, I'd sell them to you. This is how I kind of got onto this whole thing, where my interest kind of peaked in Dr. Paul. Okay, well, so let's say I'm the Federal Reserve, and my business is to print money. Well, if you want money as the United States, I'll print it for you. If you as some other company want money, or country want money, see how this works? If you as some other country want money, it's a reserve currency, man. It's good all over the world. I'll make you screws. Or if I was printing money, I'd print you money. So I learned this in Beijing, China. I landed in Beijing, China. There was building, it was before the Olympics, a couple years before the Olympics. There's all kinds of building going on. All kinds of building going on at the airport itself. And so I said to the guy we had with us, I said, what's the deal here? You're really expanding this airport. And he said, oh yeah, we're expanding for the Olympics thanks to the Federal Reserve of the United States. And I said, you mean the United States government? And that's exactly what I said. I said, you mean the United States government? She said, no, I mean the Federal Reserve. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense because the money we use is United States Treasury money. What's the deal? And that's when I started getting into reading the actual charter of the Federal Reserve Act. That's private corporations, what it is. Private corporation. Yeah.
So then, I hear that Dr. Paul is also against various intervention, and I'm sort of jumping around.
Okay.
I'm saying, if the Federal Reserve is making all these loans out,
Yes.
if a bank makes a loan, it demands some sort of collateral. What is the collateral that we have if the Federal Reserve lends money to Brazil? Or is it our Navy, Marines, Army, and Air Force that are our enforcer of that law? And that's the second part of Dr. Paul's thing about intervention?
Okay, now this is me talking, this is not Dr. Paul talking. Okay, this is me talking. The answer to your question is yes. Was anybody around in either the coast, either the East Coast or the West Coast in 1973, in November of 1973? Does anybody remember what happened in November 1973? I do, because I was in New Jersey at the time.
I was in Maryland.
You were in Maryland. You had an oil embargo. There were a bunch of countries. That got together and said, "Hey, we're gonna fix the price of oil." To make a long story short. Well, what happened is we had what was known as shuttle diplomacy at the time, and we diplomated an agreement with the OPEC countries. In fact, we shuttle diplomacy an agreement with all the countries of the world, and we said, well, let me back up. Right before there, President Nixon said that we were no longer going to honor gold to redeem for any United States currency at all, period, that's it. So at that point, there was no reason for anybody in the world to have Federal Reserve notes. So that's when, now, after the oil embargo, the agreement was made with all the nations in the world that oil could only be traded in Federal Reserve notes. Now there was a reason for the whole world to have Federal Reserve notes, because that was the only way you could trade oil.
Is that what you call corner in the market?
I would say so, yeah, I would say so. So, that's what. Since there was nothing backing it, there was no gold anymore backing it, which was keeping the world interested in using the Federal Reserve note. Now there was a reason that the only way you could trade oil was with Federal Reserve note. That's true whether you're Sweden or Japan or Saudi Arabia, doesn't make any difference what the country is. It's only Federal Reserve notes. Yeah, question?
So therefore then, understanding this then, the way we lend the money out and the way we collect it or make sure that we get it back, we become the international La Cosa Nostra.
if by we, you are saying the United States.
United States.
No, that's not correct.
Well, of the Federal Reserve.
Okay, now the Federal Reserve, I would agree with you.
But if they wag the tail, you know, or if they
You gotta
wag the
remember, the
dog.
United States is just one participant in that operation. Federal Reserve did more business in that little window of less than 2 years than what we did to run up a debt in 40 years. The Federal Reserve is a huge organization, extremely powerful, extremely powerful.
The New World Order or something.
Well, I'm not sure where
They're
that
like
is.
the dark side
I'm
on
just gonna say
Star
what
Wars.
the Federal Reserve has. So what Dr. Paul is saying is that we need to have a sound currency. By that he means a commodity-based currency of some sort, or multiple currencies once again, like the Constitution says. And we need to take a serious look at the monetary system that we have. Because as now, I think you can see, there's a lot of ramifications now to this, just for 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah, just one quick question.
Yeah.
A couple years ago, I had advised people to buy silver, you know, get out of their investments and whatnot, and some of them did over in Butte, and others lost a lot, you know, through the housing and whatnot. The next transition, and this is what I want to ask you, the next transition, which is, you know, the dollar going away, are all those that, well, only have holdings in dollars and paper assets, not gonna basically have anything?
I don't know. I don't know. Now, let's go back in history and take a look what happened in 1933. April 5th, 1933. Stop, no, where are you going?
Keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, make a long story short, the president issued an executive order that made the ownership of gold illegal for American citizens. Foreigners could own gold, but American citizens could not.
You had to turn into the government.
You had to turn into government, otherwise you had otherwise you had a $10,000 fine or 10 years in jail. Okay?
Wow.
That was an executive order. Now that was the basis for all the money, that was the monetary system up to that time. And what I tell people when they ask me that question is this: is it possible if we had the proper president, or the improper, let's say, president in the office, that history could repeat itself? Now, whether it's silver, or whether it's a Federal Reserve note, could it be that someone would issue an executive order that would say, nope, this isn't any good anymore, or it's illegal to even own it? And I think the answer is yes, that's a possibility. It's a real uncertain thing we have here. We really don't know. And that's why I would really like to see somebody right now in the White House where we know where they stand, we know what decision they would make, and you know, if you had your silver, you'd be in good shape. If you had your gold, you'd be in good shape with Dr. Paul.
Thanks, brother.
Back there, good at
By the way, let's thank Noel and Matt one more time for setting this up here. One more time for Jim and Roger for educating us. My name is John, and I'm the Northeast Iowa coordinator for the Ron Paul campaign. I've been here for about a month, and to take it back one more day, a month and a day ago, I got the opportunity to come up here. I got a phone call, said, you want to go to Iowa? I was on the plane the next day. So I really appreciate all the hospitality that I've received so far in Iowa. It really does remind me of South Carolina. Everybody smiles, shake your hands, looks you in the eye. So I was kind of nervous getting on that plane, but since being here, it's really been great. So I'm very happy to be here. Over here, I have a lot of supplies, a lot of literature. I have a couple koozies, buttons, DVD videos. Please, I would love to see this table completely empty by the time it goes. However, to see it empty, you got to take my business card as well, so make sure you grab that. I'd love to get emails from you. I'd love to get phone calls from you. I have my cell phone on me all hours a day. You're up late at night. You start thinking about sound money again because of Roger's rousing speech. Give me a call. I'll probably be up thinking about it too. With that being said, we do have a couple of county coordinators here, Rogers, one, Noel. We have our information right here, and campaign is making a big push here to identify volunteers that can help us make sure that we do win these counties, that we do win these neighborhoods, which are also called precincts, and we get Dr. Paul in the White House. Everybody knows in Iowa, the whole nation's watching and figuring out who's gonna be our next president, because there's a lot of rumblings that there's another man that's in there right now that won't be there November of next year. With that being said, if you would like to volunteer your time, I'm gonna be right over here next to the table, seeing who took what, and then sign you up to help me out. All right, so thank you again very much for coming, and Noel, would you like to add anything?
As far as Jackson County goes, I'd like to see this happen again. I'd like to see this happen a month from now, maybe sooner. And perhaps next time we can have Ron Paul here in person. I apologize for whatever wires crossed, whatever got out to the radio. Never intended to convey that Ron Paul would be here with us in person. We'd like that, and I think when the reports go back to the campaign,
We got evidence right up
there could be a good chance of getting him here and asking him questions directly. So stay in touch, please, and express interest in that, and I'll do what I can. Matt Bogus will do what he can as well to make that happen along with John. So thank you all for coming very much.
All right, everybody have at it.
I'll be staying around if anybody has any questions.
This is 99%, 99.9%. And this is some. This is